Diablo 4 will succeed where others have failed. Or at least that's what this video is saying. I generally think that Diablo 4 is going to succeed. I think it's going to have a muddled launch. I don't want to say muddled, but I'd say probably a mild launch. I don't think anything really crazy is going to happen out of the gate. I think the first season is probably going to be very uneventful. I think it's probably not going to be received with a lot of amazing reviews. And I think the game is sort of going to grow into itself through the first and second season. And then with the new content drop, it's going to grow. I think that the game, as a general game that brings in a large audience and sort of grows the ARPG market and grows Diablo's market share, I think that part of the game is going to do very well. And I think it's going to do very well amongst casual gamers, which I think a lot of review companies sort of forget that there are casual gamers who only really enjoy about 80 hours worth of content per season. And I think Diablo will have 80 hours worth of content in a given season.
So I want to take today and talk about something that I think Diablo 4 is going to amazingly succeed at, and that is as we enter into the end game. Now, I think that this is going to...
Wow, I even pay for the thing and I still have the ad. That's interesting. This is probably the first person I have seen that has outright came out and said, I think Diablo 4 is going to do good in the end game.
To really be amazing for both Diablo 2 and Diablo 3 players. For the Diablo 2 players, the world tiers make it, I think, much more balanced and not the arcade style that you might have seen from Diablo 3. But then if you are a Diablo 3 player, the Nightmare Dungeon system is...
You like Veiled Shot? Does he do a good job? That's who this is, right? I mean, he's the first person that has come out and been like, yeah, I think it's going to be good. And I like people that can look at things a little bit more objectively, that aren't just trying to clickbait 100,000 views.
Is going to be inspired sort of by the Greater Rift system, albeit much more interesting, in my opinion. Let's get into it. So I think the first thing to start with when we're talking about what we're going to be doing in Diablo 4 post-leveling is the world tier system. I've seen a lot of people talk about Nightmare Dungeons, and we're going to talk about that here, as well as some of the open world stuff that is going to be in the end game. But honestly, none of that matters nearly as much, in my opinion, to the world tier system, because the implications of how difficult things are going to be and get are really heavily, I guess you could say, implied in how the game actually scales.
And I mean, honestly, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't happen, and there's a lot of gear that doesn't drop until you get to those higher world tiers. So just entering into a fresh world tier is almost like a starting over point, because your better gear will drop for you in those higher world tiers, right?
Now, right here, we have the world tier 1 and world tier 2. Now, when you...
A little clickbaity, but at least he shows you real content to back up his theories. That's a good thing. I mean, honestly, everybody's clickbaity. Everybody's clickbaity because it's just the way the industry is kind of pushed. Oh, my fucking shoulders. It's just the way the industry is pushed. I mean, if your title's not clickbaity, nobody's going to click on it because there's 500,000 other videos out there, unfortunately. Like, truth doesn't really sell anymore.
You go ahead and look at the sort of scaling here. World Tier 1 is obviously the base difficulty, but World Tier 2 is going to give you a little bit more challenging enemies and a little bit more experience and gold. We all have experienced in the...
I feel like 1/5, like 20% is... I feel like that's more than a little bit, but I do get his point. I mean, 20%, I would argue is a pretty substantial amount. You know what I mean? If you're going to play for 10 hours... you can effectively play for 8 hours and cut 2 hours of your gameplay out. I think that's a fairly substantial bump, and I would say most players should go ahead and start out on World Tier 2.
The beta, World Tier 2, that is what I played on the entire time.
Yeah.
But as we scale up, there's actually World Tier 3 and World Tier 4 that unlocks at level 50 and above.
And that's where your gear really starts to drop. If you look, there's sacred and unique items can finally start dropping post level 50. And the Nightmare Sigils, which is when you finally gain access to some of the in-game items, Hell Tides, and champion monsters. So what you're seeing here is like level 50 is your first real foray into the end game. in sort of Diablo 4. And it looks like, honestly, you don't have to be level 50. In the beta, it said a lot of this was locked behind levels, but really it says it's locked behind the capstone. You have to clear the capstone, or I mean, obviously, probably play with somebody that's on it, and you have to complete the campaign at Cathedral of Light.
You're going to have to do specific dungeons in specific towns to unlock these modes, and you're going to actually end up with new items as well as nightmare sigils, hell tines, and champion.
And these monsters give 100% more experience, which is huge.
Monsters. And of course, if we look at the actual details of what we're going to get in terms of advantages, well, we're going to get 100% more experience, additional gold, and they're actually going to overcome some resistances that we have. Now, sacred and unique items have set stats that cannot have legendary affixes transplanted onto them. And then sacred items seem to be, again, sort of like ancients, I guess is a better way to put it, with higher stat rolls.
And that's pretty much the way I've understood it too, right? That sacred and unique are just, yeah, like ancient and stuff like that. And then unique is just unique. You can't really do anything with it.
Then we have tier 4, and now we have ancestral items. And again, it's kind of that same idea with like
and new uniques. You have to remember it says and new uniques. But if you're looking here, when you go up these next tiers, you're dropping better and better gear that you're going to want to replace all of your previous gear with. So like getting into World Tier 4 is just the start. And then you have to grind more, right, to get all those items. The only problem here is unless the Nightmare Sigils are sort of like a Mythic Plus thing where you do them, you turn them in, they get stronger, and they continually get stronger. Getting to World Tier 4, just to do World Tier 4 content easier, with maybe no access to additional harder content or content that scales up, could start to be where there's going to be a little bit of an issue. After that, it's all Paragon to 100, right? What? I thought level cap was 100, so level cap is 50? And then after that, it's all Paragon to 100. But there's unlimited Paragon, right? Paragon doesn't stop at 100. Like, you can get multiple Paragon boards, right? You gain 200 from levels and 20 from renown. So it's not unlimited? I thought it was unlimited. See, those types of things really start to pull it back for me. No, it's unlimited? Okay. Not unlimited. See, that's where I start to fear for things, because you start to run out of things to grind for.
Primals, as far as I've seen in Diablo 3, and then new unique items.
Either that, or it's going to be like either that or it's going to have to be very hard at those top levels.
Again, same thing with the base stats. This one's for level 70, and you can see here, this is the highest world tier difficulty, and you can see monsters give 200% increased experience, 15% more gold, and overcome 40% resistance. Now, it's important to note here, I actually want to compare this to Diablo 3's Greater scaling, because I think this is going to give a good idea on where kind of the difficulty, and are we going to get this like massive arcade style where we're zipping across everywhere, one-shotting everything? I don't think so. So pulling up Maxwell's site and looking at the D3 Great Rift HP scaling, basically it scales, well, quite a bit, almost about 20% per tier that you're going up. Well, I should say 17% from the previous tier is what you're going to be scaling. So this is a massive HP boost, and this goes up to 150. And as you start to get to like plus 50 tiers, let's say you're starting at level 1, Great Rift 1, and then you go to 51, well, you're getting 2,200% increased HP. Based on what we've seen in the Diablo 4 world tiers, this will not be the case. So we're not going to be doing trillions.
No, and I imagine you wouldn't want to start your base game out doing that big of a number, because you're going to start running into like hardcore issues with computation, as well as like memory limits and all sorts of other things. Like, you don't want to have that. I imagine it was going to be scaled back and the damages were going to be scaled back. My only real concern right now is that there's only 220 Paragon points possible. You don't get unlimited Paragon boards, and I'm becoming increasingly concerned that the sigil system is only just a sigil that modifies a dungeon one time. So it's just going to have different affixes or whatever, to where maybe this time it's a, explosion, and next time it's whatever, next time it's whatever. And it doesn't, okay, well, you beat it with explosion. Now the sigil becomes explosion plus 10% damage. And then every time you do it, it sort of goes up difficulty and gives you more and more difficult monsters to face. My question is going to be more on how viable this goes.
Billions of damage, it seems like, because arguably the world tiers are not going to scale nearly as hard. And I think of the world tiers sort of like the T16. For those of you that don't know, T16 is kind of like the open world in Diablo 3, the maximum difficulty where you're running bounties, etc. Now, that's going to be roughly about 1,000% increased HP. And based on what we've seen, again, I can't really talk too much about the other difficulties, but there is no increase in terms of HP from the base difficulty to World Tier 2. And so I would surmise, based on what we're seeing in terms of scaling, well, we're not going to really have a whole lot of trillions and billions of damage. And
we're not. I think he's making a fair assessment. I do think that you will have scaling, because they're scaling down your damage, right? Like monsters are just going to absorb 40% of damage or something like that. So they might not be adding right now. Eventually they'll have to, right? Because they can't just scale you down like your damage, just scale it down too bad. We'll have to wait and see, though.
And so
there's also 63 skill points, total 15 coming from Renown. I knew there were 15 from Renown. We need to see it. I'm curious now. Now I'm more curious than ever about the end game. Because I thought I had a really good grasp on it, and I was very, very happy with it. But more and more, I've become more indifferent.
Give us a glimpse into kind of how our builds are going to shape up, and arguably for the better, because I think a lot of people, especially from D2, dislike the fact that in D3, all you do is load up a bunch of movement speed and try to one-shot your way through everything. And I think this is much more akin to something that they would enjoy.
No, I do think that, like, the fighting, the combat, the damage, I do think it's going to be I think it's going to be a good experience.
Now, here's where I think Diablo 4's endgame starts to become something that no other game really has done a great job. And the first thing is going to be the Whispers of the Dead, or the Tree of Whispers. Basically, around the world, there's going to be these whispers displayed on your map, and you're going to go to them, get rewarded with experience, gold, and grim favors. Supposedly, these are going to be like the open world events that we experienced in beta, albeit kind of supercharged. And then you can exchange these grim favors for essentially loot and experience, which we saw in the end game beta footage.
And he's talking about the Whisper Tree, right? Which is like the bounty tree.
This is basically encouraging people to run around and do open world events. We will see if these loot and experience boxes essentially are going to be comparable to Nightmare Dungeons. As far as we've seen, it looks like it's going to be worth doing. And as long as this is worth doing, I think this makes it a lot more interesting in terms of kind of sort of akin to the MMO style, which
and what it's going to boil down to, and we've talked about this numerous times. So say the Whispers do give you viable loot, right? Say they give you viable in-game loot. If running Whispers gives you equal loot to running Nightmare Dungeons, okay? Not better, not worse, equal. If it gives you equal loot and you can do them faster than you can do a Nightmare Dungeon, not a single player will ever touch Nightmare Dungeons outside of collecting specific items. Everyone will run the open world Whisper stuff, because that will become meta, because it's faster, because gamers want to do things the most effective way possible. If it only drops like bounty mats and stuff like that for upgrading, and it doesn't drop very good gear, or it does drop good gear but it's very rare and very random, and that your odds are better of getting gear you need from Nightmare Dungeons, right? And that there are only specific drops you need from the Whispers, then everybody will run Nightmare Dungeons, and nobody will run Whisper content unless they're farming for a specific piece of gear. That is the sort of crux issue that happens when you have multiple in-game systems. I am for multiple in-game systems because it gives you sort of a way to mix up what you're doing. The problem around it is it's very hard to balance because you have to find a way to make all of them equally rewarding, or people will only do the most rewarding sort of activity.
Which I know that a lot of people may not enjoy that, but I do think it lends itself to a much more interesting sort of end game rather than just running the same Greater Rift or same Mephisto runs over and over and over again. Then, of course, we have the Nightmare Dungeons. These Nightmare Dungeons are basically regular dungeons with an added challenge. Some of the challenges could be something like double bosses. All enemies are invisible until you actually get into combat with them. Or like what we saw in that endgame footage where you have the blood portals where you have to close them by killing all the monsters.
And I think that's a cool idea, and I think there are definitely going to be some fun sort of added ways to play through these Nightmare Dungeons that are going to mix up your gameplay to where it doesn't always feel the same, even if it is the same. I will still default back to my original position saying I had hoped it was going to be a tiered sort of system, sort of like Mythic Plus, and it's not. At least it doesn't sound like it is, which really limits sort of some of the viability I saw as an in-game activity, but we do need to play it to fully see. How you doing, Kalo?
These nightmare sigils can definitely up the difficulty levels and supposedly can go up infinitely, which also determines sort of your rarity of your item.
So the part that they go up infinitely is the part that's interesting, because how do they go up infinitely? If they go up like a Mythic Plus key where you beat it and then it progressively gets harder, or if it's just going to be they can just randomly drop at sort of a different sort of difficulty or rarity, that's going to be where things get a little bit more interesting. And by interesting, I mean suck, because it's going to be very hard to find the exact ones you want, right? Did you have a good holiday, Kayla?
Item drops, so potentially it's an additional ancestral or sacreds. Now, also the dungeon affixes that I mentioned earlier are based on these nightmare sigils as well, so these will customize them even further depending on how many you use them. Now, on top of that, we already know what we're getting into when we're entering these dungeons, so we can plan around these things with the proper, I guess you could say, team comp or build based on the nightmare sigils that we are using. Now, I find this to be a lot more interesting than just running the same thing with a similar map layout.
See, I think that it sounds interesting, but the problem we're going to have right now, and I'm always playing devil's advocate, so like you might catch me in another video and be talking about how awesome this is, but I fully think that it's best to really like look through both sides. So right now, with all the information that's come out, I think one of the biggest issues we're going to have is the inability to fully sort of spec your character depending on what your affixes are, because we don't have any ability to save our loadouts, which is something that came out here recently, and the fact that respecking, while it might be cheaper now, which I'm on for, is not entirely free. So you can't just get a sigil and go, oh shit, I need X build, and then respec out to that build because it costs you money. And every time you do it, it costs you money. So that is definitely something that I think would need to be fixed, right? For sure. You ate some food to nothing special? Aw. So what are you doing today?
And the exact same mechanics, meaning like, let's say I'm going to do D2, right? What's the same thing over and over and over again? There really isn't a whole big...
I'm happy that it's not the same thing over and over again. I'm happy that there are going to be different ways to do it and different types of monsters and different objectives and different sort of modifiers. I think all of this is very good, and it is definitely going to lend itself to a lot better replayability. Like, I agree with this 100%.
Difference, but maybe there's different maps. Maybe you move a slightly different way. You can use a different build potentially, but I think that's a lot less interesting than actually changing some of the affixes again, potentially like double bosses. So now you kind of want to go in with a boss killing build so that you can actually do that. Or potentially like the blood portals, right? So now you have to go in and maybe you want to run with a lot more AoE because you have to clear a lot more trash. Who knows how much.
Just hanging out with the puppies and the kittens. It sounds like a good day though.
Many other sigils
would you eat?
Are there? But I think these end up making it so that some of the more build variety is going to be necessary based on the sigils, and you're going to be min-maxing certain parts of your build for these specific affixes and sigils.
I'm hopeful that he's right? Like, I'm hopeful that you might have to do some min-maxing and some moving around. I'm hoping that it's not so much that it becomes really a problem for a more casual gamer, especially with the fact that we can't save our loadouts. Because trying to min-max is going to suck if you have to respec every time, and you have to constantly go to like max roll, or you have to constantly have spreadsheets up that tell you exactly what skills you need for what builds, and what pieces of gear, and run back to your chest and switch out your gear, and then you don't have enough money and stuff like that. So I'm very hopeful because I would like this. But I think that there's a lack of certain systems to fully allow this to flourish the way I think we would like it to. You're concerned different builds are going to be better or worse depending on the affects? Oh, yeah, for sure. No, I agree. Like, certain things are just not going to be near as viable, especially if you're built all around, like, I don't know, shadow damage. And it's like a resist shadow is like one of the affixes. And you're a rogue that's all shadow damage. Well, you're not doing anything. You know what I mean? Your dad grilled some burgers, corn on the cob, Nashville hot deviled eggs. They were a hit. Dude, it sounds like it. All of that sounds very good. That sounds like really good food.
I think this lends itself to a much more interesting playstyle, because oftentimes when you're running in D3, for example, if I run, I don't know, let's say a Tal Rasha wizard build, I make a couple modifications if I want to speed farm for Paragon level or just to solo push. But as soon as I do that solo push, I run the exact same build over and over and over again. In fact, I cannot change it really at all in the combat. So it really doesn't, I guess you say, mix up your gameplay at all. And I think this will, and I think that's what makes itself such an interesting sort of end game concept. Now, of course, if you're a casual player, you may not even be doing any of this. You may just run in, do your dungeon, same build over and over and over again.
And that's probably what the most casual gamers will do, is try to find like a viable pre-built sort of run everything, and that's what they'll do. For the more hardcore players, it's hopeful that there's going to be enough depth here. But I have a feeling that the systems are more designed around casual players right now, and that it's actually going to be more of a disadvantage and more of a hassle to try to do some of these crazy hardcore things right now, because there are no systems built in place for it. What did I do? I did nothing. I did absolutely nothing, which was amazing. They have one boss in D3 that's immune to cold damage. Which boss is it? I've never even paid attention.
But I think that arguably, if you're going to talk about your casual players, then the end game doesn't really matter a whole lot, because people are just enjoying the game. That's kind of what a casual player does.
All right, so I'm going to take huge offense sort of with what he just said there. You, as a developer, better pay attention to your casual player base. They are the people who bankroll your game, and they're the people who continue to play your game all the time. They're the ones that are spending the money. They're the ones doing all that. That's your casual player base. The end game is something for them. Now, they might not be pushing the leaderboards. They might not be pushing the end game right at the beginning. They might not be playing the end game the way a hardcore gamer plays the end game. But eventually, they're going to get past that level 70, and they're going to want to play the end game. And the end game for them should play just as good as it does for your hardcore player that got there on week 2, when it takes them up to week 10 to get there. Any content creator that sort of dismisses casual players or casual players' experience in any aspect of the game, I think should, and maybe he didn't, maybe I'm just really misunderstanding what he said, but I think they should really evaluate their sort of position. You can encounter it doing bounties. Well, good thing I don't run cold anymore. That does suck, though. Yeah. So what are you doing tonight, Kayla? Your biggest fear, immune monsters that fuck you by being immune to your main damage. And I think those are kind of things that would hurt somebody who isn't no-lifing this game, that can't just instantly spec out. Do you know what I mean? And that's where I think you would piss off the majority of your player base if your casual players had finally grinded all their gear and it's like week 9 in the season, and there's only, 3 weeks left, and they're ready to do some in-game grinding with their buddies, and they start finding 10-12% of the dungeons they go into, their damage type, the gear they've grinded for and they've got that have gotten them that far is completely no good, and they can't do any damage. That is going to really piss off your casual players in a way that would possibly tank a game. You looked it up. Occupied Ruins. The only immune game, it's unique. His title is Cold Immune under his name. Well, that's not good. If I ever see him, I'll have to keep him in mind.
I think the end game tends to be more appealing to your hardcore / more dedicated audience. And When you consider talking about the end game, I generally have that audience in mind. Now, I do think that despite this, I think a lot of people are going to be casual players, the vast majority, in every game. And I think that still, this is going to be an extremely fun thing to do, even if you're not min-maxing it, just to constantly grind up sort of your levels in these nightmare sigils and nightmare dungeons. I'm pretty excited about this, and I think that this is going to be a lot more interesting than Diablo 2 and Diablo 3's current endgame. Speaking as someone who is a definitely hardcore player, who plays a lot more than your average person, so this is pretty exciting to me, and I wanted to share it with you all, and I think that it's going to be a lot better and a lot more fun than Diablo 3 and Diablo 2, because me personally, I know some people disagree and they can run the same Mephisto run or run Great Rifts over and over and over again and not be bored at all. To me, I like the novelty of new seasons and I enjoy those games, although I haven't really played too much Diablo 2. I really enjoy Diablo 3 for a short period of time before it kind of grows and gets stale based on the season. And hopefully with Diablo 4's Nightmare Dungeon, I still think that will happen, because I do not disagree with anyone saying that these are repetitive. I still think they're going to be repetitive, but I think that'll be a little bit more variety when we get to that end game. And hopefully, again, with that season kind of mechanic in Diablo 4, it'll do that same thing that Diablo 3 does for me.
And I agree. I think that Diablo 4 will eventually sort of get repetitive, the same as every game does. I could see where I think it's going to be an improvement over Diablo 2. It's going to be an improvement over Diablo 3. I think it's going to be maybe a little bit under the complexity of something like Last Epoch. I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as involved as Path of Exile. I think it's going to fall in this sort of area between Diablo 2, 3, and Last Epoch. And I think the goal there is to add enough systems, enough complexity to give people something to do, to maybe keep your hardcore players there for an extra couple weeks, and to give your casual players more to do throughout the season, and sort of give them a solid baseline to build on. I do think Diablo 4 is going to succeed. I do see sort of some glaring issues, but I'm very happy and very excited for Diablo 4. But the real question is, what do you guys think? You guys need to let me know down in the comments what you think, what you're excited for in Diablo 4, and what you're not looking forward to. We've went over what I'm excited for, but definitely let me know. And as always, have a great day.